Dear guys, good evening. In this second video, we will finish. I will try to finish shortly the history of Roman Empire, and in particular, last time we saw the beginning of Roman history, so from the mythical foundation until the end of the Republic, which occurred around the 30 before Christ. In particular, we saw that in 27 before Christ, Octavian, or Augustus, as in that year it took the name of Augustus, he became the sole leader, the sole Roman leader, and so the studio says that in this period, in this year, began the Roman Empire. Actually, we have to point out that officially the government was republican. So the previous republican institution, like the Senate, did not disappear. But actually Augustus assumed absolute powers. So, for example, the Senate existed in those years, but actually its powers decreased. With Augustus, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was established, and this dynasty lasted until the 68 AD. The emperors of the dynasty, of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, were Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudio, and Nero. The dynasty is so called due to the gens Julia, that was the family of Augustus. Actually, it was the family of Caesar, but as we said before in the previous lesson, in the previous video, Caesar adopted Augustus. Instead, the gens Claudia was the family of Tiberius, that became emperor after the death of Augustus, which occurred in 14 AD. Actually, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was a controversial dynasty, because while Caligula and Nero are usually remembered as mad emperors in popular culture, Augustus and also Claudius were great emperors in domestic policy, but also in military. In particular, Claudius, who became emperor after Caligula in 41 AD, conquered great part of the eastern part of Europe of the time, like the Thrace. And his most important deed was the beginning of the conquest of Britain. Claudius was emperor for 13 years, and he was poisoned by his wife Agrippina in 54 AD. Agrippina was also a controversial figure. She was a very powerful woman, and in particular she decided to kill Claudius, as the following emperor was her son, Nero, that in 54 AD was just only 70 years old. So, in some way she could control him, and in some way she could control the politics, the Roman politics of the time. It's important to point out that at the beginning Nero was quite immature, and so he was helped in ruling the empire by a lot of intellectuals of the time. I want to remind you especially the figure of Seneca. Seneca was an important intellectual, an important philosopher, but he wrote also some work of literature, and in particular he belonged to the philosophical current of Stoicism, a very important philosophical current in the ancient Rome, and he helped Nero for the first 5 years of his empire. Then he left. Nero is widely known as the first persecutor of Christians, and in fact, we have to remember that under his reign there was the martyrdom of Saint Peter and Saint Paul. We have also to remind Nero for the Great Fire of Rome, rumored to have been started by the emperor himself. However, as I told before, Nero was considered, still nowadays is considered as a mad emperor, and actually he died in 68 AD. 68 AD was quite a complex year for Rome. There were different emperors, there were wars between them. But however, after this short period, the Flavians became the second dynasty to rule Rome. Under the Flavians, Rome continued its expansion, and in particular the most important emperor of the Flavian dynasty was Vespasian. Vespasian is famous as he started the construction of the Colosseum. You can find the picture of the Colosseum in the image of the video. As you probably know, Colosseum is a big amphitheater, and still nowadays in Rome you can see part of it. But also Vespasian is famous because he fought in a war against Jewish people, and his son Titus, who became emperor later, destroyed the temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Another important emperor of Flavian dynasty was Domitian. He was a cruel emperor. He tried to persecute his rivals, and in particular he had a terrible relationship with the Senate, and he was killed, by the way, in 96 AD, and so the Flavian dynasty ended. After his death, the Senate rapidly appointed Nerva as emperor. Nerva's empire was quite short, and after him, a new dynasty, the Antonine dynasty, developed. Under the Antonine dynasty, Rome reached its territorial and economical zenith, apogee. This was a peaceful time for Rome. In fact, for the first time, the criteria for choosing an emperor were the qualities of the candidate and no longer ties of kinship. One of the most important emperors of the time was Trajan. Trajan conquered Dacia, and also he annexed the province of Arabia. Trajan's real dream and also final war was against Persia. He probably wanted to conquer Persia, and in particular he was inspired by the myth of Alexander the Great that in the 4th century succeeded in conquering Persia, and but actually he did not succeed, as he won some battles, but actually he was obliged to withdraw due to some health problems, and in fact he died in 117 AD. Before dying, he nominated Hadrian as his heir, and you have to think that under Hadrian we have a great cultural period for Rome that was quite influenced by Greek culture. And in this period, as I told in the first lesson, Roman got the maximum extension of the land, of lands. This prosperity lasted until the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius. We are in the final part of the 2nd century AD, and in particular the Roman decadence began with Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, that was killed in 192 AD. The following years are known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In particular, during those years, the Roman state was plagued by civil wars, external invasions, political chaos, and also pandemics and economic problems. But it was also, a cultural crisis. In fact, the old Roman values and also the old Roman pagan religion had fallen, as Christianity had begun to spread through the population. A very important moment in the history, in the Roman history of the 1st century, occurred in 284 AD, when Diocletian became emperor. A new form of government was established, the Tetrarchy. As I told before, in the 3rd century, the emperors were quite weak. And in fact, the frontiers of the empire were abandoned, since the emperors were mostly concerned with defeating rivals and establishing their power. So, thanks to this tetrarchy, the empire was divided among 4 emperors, 2 in the western part of it and 2 in the eastern part of it. So the empire was divided in 2 parts, western part and eastern part, and each part was ruled by 2 different emperors. Diocletian is also famous because he promoted some persecution against Christians. But as I told before, Christian religion was developing, and so the emperors could not deny that. In fact, at the beginning of the 3rd century, something very important occurred. In 306 AD, Constantine assumed the empire as a tetrarch, and in 313 he promoted the Edict of Milan, which for the first time guaranteed liberty for Christians to profess their religion. Constantine himself converted to Christianity. Well, actually, we don't have to think that he was really Christian. He did that just only for political reason. As I told you before, during those years, Roman emperors were quite weak. So, all of them tried to get the support of increasing part of Roman population. And as I told before, Christianity was spreading in the Roman Empire, so Constantine tried to get the support of Christians. A very important step in history of Christian religion occurred also in 380, when the Emperor Theodosius promoted the Edict of Thessalonica, thanks to which Christianity became the official faith of the Roman Empire, and the previous pagan religion was banned. But Roman Empire was collapsing, especially the west part of Roman Empire, and in particular, at the beginning of the 5th century, barbarians were creating a lot of problems in the lands of Roman Empire, especially in the western land of Roman Empire, and in 410 there was the famous sack of Rome made by the Visigoths. The western part of Roman Empire definitively collapsed in 476 AD, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustus, was dethroned. And actually, if you think, it's quite funny thing, because the name of the last emperor of Roman Empire is Romulus Augustus. If you think to what we said so far, Romulus was the name of the first king, of the founder of Rome, and Augustus was the name of the first emperor, of the first of the man who brought Rome to its zenith, economically and also socially, culturally speaking. So it is quite funny to notice the name of the final emperor. And so in the studios say that in 476 AD, the Middle Age started. As I told before, the Roman Empire, since the 3rd century, the end of 3rd century, was divided in 2 parts. So the western part collapsed at the end of the 5th century, while the Eastern Empire had a different fate. It lasted for more than 1,000 years and collapsed just only in 1453, when the Turkish Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, which nowadays is famous as Istanbul. We finished our historical introduction now, and next time we will start analyzing grammar and especially Latin pronunciation.